Hi. Okay. My name is Celiany Rivera. I use she and they pronouns, ella y elle. I have had the honor to respond and see these papers and presentations before, and I always feel so happy when I get the opportunity to respond to really new, innovative, amazing work. And I will try to not make this too ready. Like, I don't want to read because we've processed a lot of really good information, so I want to share how I see these very different presentations connect and perhaps open up some questions so that we can collectively use the little bit of time that we have so that we can think collectively about this beautiful work that was presented. So I would like to start with Boa Baroque because I don't think it's any coincidence that the image of the boa or the serpent. Can I put this a little lower? Porque me siento que estoy un poquito. Okay. ¿Cómo lo hago? ¿Aquí? Lo puedo sacar. Okay. Sí, gracias. Okay, más cómoda. Okay. Porque siento que. Oh, I'm sorry. Switch to Spanish. Okay. I feel that the image of the serpent or the boa represents so much when we actually look at Afro-Indigenous mythology, cosmology, and representations of nature, right? And I think that when we think about archetypes of animals, I think that the serpent is a really big archetype of human nature. The tiger is a really big archetype. The hippopotamus is a really big archetype of human nature, and the heron, right? And those are very used in mythology to represent air, fire, earth. ¿Qué me falta? Agua. So the hippopotamus is the one that I feel relates more to yours. This is weird, but this is what happens when you get me as a respondent. Because the hippopotamus thrives in seeing what ecosystems could flourish by itself just being in water. And so just by the hippopotamus being ahí, it creates life. Birds, flies, mosquitoes, dirt accumulates on the back of the hippopotamus that has the essential role of doing nothing so that other people can sustain themselves, right? That's what I thought about. And then in connection with the boa itself represents the earth, no? The serpent is, I don't know this word in English, can you help me? Sinuous? Como sinuosa. Es armoniosa, es ondulante, ondulant, is sensual. It talks about sensual movement. It talks about also sexual nature. It talks about the monstrosity behind the beast that is about to do something really beautiful, to feed themselves and keep ecosystems going. So I think that there's something really beautiful about the serpent and the hippopotamus being in conversation, because there's a voraciousness, there's energy that is represented in the serpent, in the boa, that goes from the pelvic desire of I'm hungry, I need to eat, to how I look at you, hey, and how that communicates that, no? Because a lot of what the serpent does is move in a very sinuous way to camouflage or disimularse, no? So in those ways, I thought that these papers actually are in a lot of conversations with each other. And I think that I really want to congratulate Gustavo on doing this presentation at a distance because it was super engaging. I really appreciated the music, and I really appreciated it's hard to present when you're not here. So thank you, Gustavo, you rocked it. And also thank you to the folks in IT who like cued that music and were like jamming with it. I saw you. And I think that that's a little bit of what I sort of like want to address, that being part of this dialogue and being part of all of this focus in the Americas, particularly in the South of Americas, it is particularly important to happen from the United States, where we're speaking right now, in this moment in time, because we are in a deeply anti-Black, misogynistic, anti-LGBTQ violence, increased government surveillance all over the planet. And I think that it is important to recognize how all of us are battling all of that through many different fronts, because it is on every front, right? So from academia, from corporate, from law, from international, from whatever you stand, it is important. And I think that this work that is happening now, to be in conversation with each other, is part of that. It's part of creating that larger dialogue of decolonization, right? And I think that that's also what all of this works have in common, and that is that it helps us understand how corporeity or our corporalidad is lived from very different angles that do not center on oppression, that do not center on necessarily feeling marginalized, but actually focus on la hojarasca, en la hoja que pasa. That was there. I didn't make it. I just painted it. I thought that was beautiful. And I think that that's where each of these papers bring in something really beautiful. I think that thinking about the paper of Death is Drag, I really love the notion of the gambiarra. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, and how it connects to this very similar Caribbean notion that this Haitian scholar has proposed, which is rassemblage. Maybe some of you have heard of rassemblage, which is a Creole identity, a Creole word that talks about assembly, compilation, enlisting, regrouping, and this could be regrouping ideas, regrouping things, regrouping spirits. So I think that I thought about that concept a lot as I was listening Gustavo talk about gambiarra. And it also, Gustavo's work also resonated for me with this work that was published by this author of Delgado's last name on this volume on Trans Studies Quarterly that talked about being trans in the Americas. In that particular article, I love the mention of the disruption of use of drag to interrupt life as is, right? And something similar is happening here in what Gustavo is discussing. In that paper, that activist was talking about a Mexican trans feminist artist, probably you know them, Gustavo, called Lía García, La Novia Sirena, who made weekly visits to dorms in the prison just to enact weddings with prisoners. And this in turn created what they coined a notion of hypertenderness, or una hiperternura, that folks were not able to access in those spaces, right? So sometimes decolonization looks as just disrupting the space, kind of like you disrupt a funeral with a drag performance. And I think that when I was reading about your work, Gustavo, I feel like Gustavo is a spirit. Gustavo, when I was reading about your work, I was reminded of Arnaldo Cruz Malavé's new recent work published on Small Access about mourning and the idea of protest and activism as an act of mourning as well. So I think that I see a lot of connections, and I would love to talk to each of you independently. And in terms of the work that you were presenting in particular, I was taken aback with the idea of creating bigness from smallness, of creating, like, is beyond found objects, which I think it's a beautiful sort of making art, is about found nature and how to make sense of nature in a different way. And I really love that this kind of cosmology encapsulates the past, the present, the future in its design that is both abstract and is schematic, and it paints a map on how to live the world, and how to see the world in a particular way. And I don't want to miss anything, because I made some additional notes as I was sitting here. Yes, this is what I want to conclude. And all of this works together made me reflect about some recent work that has come out, and it's not from the academy, which I love to do. It's like, can we talk to other people besides the four of us? There's other people, right? So this knowledge that I'm going to share with you comes from a deck, a cards deck. And this person, Moni Enriquez, if you know Moni, okay. So they're based here in New York City. So they present this idea of the collective, and I just want to share it with you so that we can sort of like see if it resonates with some of what we've been talking about, and wrap it up at that, and start thinking about your questions as I finish with this. So thinking collectively means thinking about our capacity to love. Collective care is honoring the interdependence amongst humans and the planet. Collective care recognizes that systems of oppression don't want us well. Afro-Indigenous, and I would add queer, cosmovisions in the Americas have taught us about our interdependence, where the collective is always at the center. Our ancestors know this, and our bodies still know this. We heal when we come back to a framework of collectivity, of abundance over scarcity, of respect for the living, and for reverence for the sacredness all around us. Thank you.
So we're going to open up to the Q&A immediately. So go ahead and just raise your hand. You can ask to whoever is up at the table right now, and I'm going to give you the mic.
Thank you so much for your talks. This is kind of for anyone who wants to answer it, I guess. But I'm interested in if either of you have thought through the use of the word cosmology or cosmovision to refer to indigenous knowledge, and if you see, what are the benefits of using this term, and are there any problems with using this term? I've been thinking through what's at stake in the term cosmology as opposed to just knowledge or system, and so I just wanted to hear if either of you had any responses to that, or have thought through maybe like a different vocabulary to refer to your objects of study. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to say it first, or can I answer it first? You can answer, yes. Hello. I totally get what you're saying. I think that since we have an epistemology that is born in a system of knowledge that is born in another structure of language, we will always have this miscommunication and this balance. I think that choosing the right words to talk about what we are dealing with, it's an advance of technology, of human technology. I personally use on my research cosmovision, cosmology, because I think that there are more pros than cons than using epistemologies and knowledge and systems. But it's extremely hard to address the thing that wasn't thought in a structure of linguistics and psychology that isn't ours. So between these names, I prefer to use cosmology, which I use in my research, because I think it's more adequate. But I think that I'm really open to discuss these ideas in these forms in another terminologies. But I think that what I choose to do is to use the one that has the least cons and has a more similar adequacy to what I'm saying and to what I'm addressing.
I mean, I also have like reservations and thoughts about that. And what I've done and sort of attest to the difficulty of choosing the word is sometimes speaking of cosmology and then sometimes speaking of philosophy, and then I guess I'm still thinking of how to best refer to also social practices at the same time, which is what I'm really interested in terms of how, well, in the broader context of this research is honestly, it's about how images bear upon like conduct and social attitudes towards commonality. So I sympathize a lot with the unease about the terminology. I also think, and I think that maybe it's worth pointing out that there's something about the fact that this is a conventional way of designating this. So it's also kind of a gesture that favors being readable, even though we could probably argue that it's better to engage more deeply with it. Honestly, I think that the convention has a lot to do with the choice, yeah.
I would just like to add up to this that I think that the discussion of queerness is extremely helpful to this dialogue because it's a contest of categorization, a contest of labels and names that don't work 100%. So we are always in this battle. So I think that putting the three of us, the four of us together to talk about indigenous systems, native systems, and queerness, or talking epistemologically the same thing about how these terminologies don't work anymore and how we can figure out ways to understand and to think that about in a better and more respectful and more loving way. And I think that can always be addressed in this sense.
Yeah.
In case virtually, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this incredible education. It's kind of a curveball, but enters in this conversation of language. I keep thinking about, we keep repeating decolonization. We're using a colonizer word to fight colonization. And I think this comment that you made about Cosmo, I'm wondering, why did you ask that? Is that because the Cosmo makes it a little woo-woo and less academic? So the question is, I think what I heard you saying is a form of resistance. It's a form of pushing back and saying, no, we're gonna use our own language, and eventually maybe we can queer this colonized academia. So the question is, what is the equivalent word for decolonization? Because I'm thinking, if we continue to fight colonization, we're coming from the oppressed, from the least side. What is the word about? Is it empowerment? Is it what are we trying to do here, right? I think there's a point in which we stop fighting it and we start pushing back a new story that's coming from a lot of what you're saying. It's like this human, non-human is equal. Because I've been looking at a lot of object oriented ontology, which I think has an European version or to what we are trying to speak from our Latin American, So I don't know if it's relevant or if you have any comments on it or anyone. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. I think there's also a meme that talks about that every deep philosophical issue is actually a linguistic issue. So maybe we are talking about problems of language and not problems of philosophy. But I think that sometimes we can redefine some terminologies. Sometimes we can reinforce these terminologies. Sometimes we can replace them or place them in another meaning. For example, when we talk about colonization and we talk about catechization, we can talk also about slavery. We can talk about another forms of submission and imposition of faith and belief that are also usually read as a good sign in the colonial history of transposing European religion or a notion of good to pure people, the indigenous people. But I think that we are talking about language again, and I think that we have a big problem there because we don't have a specific term to address these questions. For example, when she mentioned the term cosmology, I think there is a difference of understanding European or Eurocentric or white knowledge, and usually people don't want to put the indigenous knowledge in the same sphere as the European one, so they use cosmology as if it was built on an esoteric system or a system of belief that is broader. So I strongly believe that we have no right way to address the questions. I think that there are some ways that we can tone down the words or to spread a little bit more of description of what actually happened and still happens. But I think that for example, the permanence of a lot of words are still very strong and still very important. For example, in queer studies, like people who identify as women, like it's very important that this name still is present, although it has a lot of problems, has a lot of social issues, but it's always very strong and holds a lot of meaning that is very akin to that phenomena. But what I'm trying to say is that we have numerous ways to do that. I don't think there is a correct way, but I think that using the vocabulary that was given us in a questioning matter is the better way to do it, and not to just avoid it completely, but how can we dialogue in a broader sense, but also incorporating native and other forms of knowledge of systems or believings and thinking, and how we can reposition that.
What just occurred to me, and this is not going to be a very fully formed thought, but the fact that this discussion about cosmology is so kind of unnerving, I think also speaks to the fact that whenever we want to share or perform scholarship about spirituality, everybody gets uneasy. So in my own work, in my own dissertation, where I talk about Chernanahuakiwe and the Yanomami beliefs, I also talk about Catholic cosmologies and spiritism, and I don't necessarily think that one of them exists in cosmology and the other one exists in another realm. I think that it's all part of the same, I can read them all as imaginaries, which is what I'm doing in my dissertation, so I think it's also just the fact that it's not hegemonic spirituality that makes us nervous about how to name it.
Sí, 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 claro, siempre. I want to name I want to name that while I believe that critiques of coloniality are present in all of your works, I want to name that that's something that I brought to this room, to this conversation, and I didn't mean to create this question. My bad. Pero it's very present because I was in an amazing panel yesterday about Palestine and how we are all at the edge of the battle, but we have a role being at the edge. And somebody in the panel mentioned this idea, and I can't stop thinking about it, which is in this question, como así que tenemos, we have this deep question of like, is it de, is it neo, is it post, is it anti? Like, what is the difference between de and anti-colonial? Like, how should I feel? Where should I stand? We have to read so much, right? Like, there's so much that has been published, especially over the last 5 to 10 years about this, that I have been 3 years in a research position and I've gotten to half of it and I still don't know how to position myself, right? So in the midst of all of that, one of the things that blew my mind yesterday is like, we don't really have to be thinking so much about when decolonization started, because decolonization started the minute colonization started, right? So if colonization started, resistance has always been part. And this art has always been part. You know, the conservation of language has been part, right? So all of, for decolonization to start, colonization had to start, so it started immediately after, or along with it. So that has been very present these days in terms of how to think about it. In my work in particular, there's a few, I talk a lot about this concept, this neologism that a Puerto Rican artist has coined, and we all use it now. It's called hallaera, or being hallao, you know. You see, it's common knowledge because this Puerto Rican did it, and now we all know what hallaera means. Hallaera is a neologism to talk about being blissful, moments of bliss that you experience when the universe syncs perfectly with what you intended to do at that time. It is not connected to progress. It is not connected to ideas of getting more. It is connected to small spurts of happiness that happen here and there. And when that is sung by a queer woman who is in 40 plus years and is over 300 pounds, when she says, I am happy, I'm haya, that means something. So a lot of people have come to talk about that as, what do they call it? Decolonial joy. Hayaera, they call it decolonial joy. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. I prefer, and I don't know if you agree, to think about it as queer bliss, which is, you agree, which is kind of like alluding to what you were saying, what would we call something, kind of like cosmology conversation. What would we call something with what we want to critique, you know? So what would we call decolonial joy? If we want to decolonize it, what would we put it on the title, kind of thing? So at the moment, I'm calling it queer, C-U-C-U-I-R, queer joy. To not call it decolonial joy, sí en español, C-U-I-R. Exacto. Exacto. There's a bunch of literature around that too. So I think that, just to make it super brief, this intervention is that because decolonization is a process and not a word, I think that we have to think about multiple words of what decolonization could look like in different contexts. For some countries and some cultures is the notion of Ubuntu. For some other notions, for Andean, ¿cómo se dice? Andean culture, puede ser I wrote it down. El buen vivir. El buen vivir. Que no es querer más, ¿no? No es el mejor vivir, el progreso, el capitalismo, el mejor trabajo, the next phone. Es el buen vivir. Vivir con lo suficiente, lo que se tenga, lo que se pueda. Ubuntu para algunas culturas, ¿no? Y este trabajo no es un trabajo que yo estoy haciendo, estoy en conversación con personas de todo el mundo que están tratando de pensar en la decolonización, no solamente de Abya Yala, que es como se le llama en América, sino Abya Yala. Chequéate el trabajo de Jude. We'll chat. De Abya Yala, but also how it looks in the continent of Africa. How does decolonization looks there? How does decolonization looks in Malta, that used to be ruled by England and used to be ruled by Spain and used to be ruled by the Arabs? You know, how does decolonization looks in Philippines, Hawaii, Guam? I'll stop.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, so we're going to take a small break before our keynote lecture that we've been waiting and anticipating for so long. So we're going to take a quick break and reconvene again at 4. Gracias, Mateus. Gracias, Elvira, Celiany, Gustavo.